Wyoming's three main commodities, natural gas, coal, and oil, are in bust cycles with no sign of ending. As a result, state coffers are down drastically and the unemployment rate is rising. But even if market conditions improve, regulations are inevitable to ward off damage from greenhouse emissions. That spells continued financial trouble for our state. The director of the University of Wyoming Center for Energy Economics and Public Policy says revising the state's approach to raising revenue could help. Rob Godby spoke earlier with our Erlanda Jacinto.
Are we capable of handling diversification of the economy?
In Wyoming, well, we could. We've moved and changed our economy from one thing to another, over our history, but it's a big, big job. We're really dependent on primary commodities used for energy now, and to move away from that will take a lot of change.
Is it moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy the problem?
If what you're trying to do is get away from kind of the cycles that energy goes through, then what you want to do is move to something that is less correlated with energy, so something that really has nothing to do with energy, so that it'll still be there when energy goes up and down. And that's tougher, right? So you've got to identify maybe what sectors, what opportunities we have here that might attract new businesses or new activity that would lead to a different direction. And then the second thing is you want to get it on the kind of scale, you want to develop it on a massive scale, because energy is so much a part of our economy that any new sectors moving here, if you want to offset that energy boom and bust cycle, you need a very large sector or sectors in something else. So you have to attract a lot of activity. So that's really kind of the two challenges we face.
Would wind energy be one of those? Or if we're moving away from energy, what other sources does Wyoming have?
Sure. So start first with the wind energy. That easily could be one aspect, right? So wind energy is not dependent on fossil fuel cycles. So, we don't have to worry about OPEC raising or lowering prices or natural gas prices collapsing due to fracking or something like that, right? Now, we would have to worry about electricity and other types of sources, just general electricity prices, but, generally that's far less variable, at least on a long-term scale. So you could move into wind energy. We have lots of resources here, but a problem with wind energy is it doesn't employ very many people, right? So you build a wind farm, say a typical 100 megawatt wind farm, it might employ maybe 200 people for a summer to construct it. It's like a large highway project, and then they're gone. And then you have maybe 5 people working at the wind farm, a plant operator, engineer, meteorologist, and some service people, maybe an admin. And that's it, 5 to 7 people maximum, and that's your production and your employment. Now, it would generate output, and that would generate revenue for the owners. That would be good. It creates property taxes, creates sales taxes. In Wyoming, we're the only state where we actually have a wind tax, so every unit of electricity you produce from wind creates revenue, but it's really small relative to the revenues we get from other things. So that could be one answer. If you look at the wind system, like wind energy as a larger system, like an ecosystem, so you have the tower, the generator, the blades, you could have manufacturing facilities that build those, but that would, to locate in Wyoming would require a lot of wind energy being built in Wyoming to justify it. We have some projects that might do that, like Sierra Madre Chokecherry. That's going to be a huge 3,000 megawatt farm, maybe 1,500 turbines maybe in the air. I mean, that's a lot of production that'll be necessary. That might justify that activity. So you could have other activities that, industrial activities, building things that move in, but it wouldn't be a really big sector. And then there's another problem after that, which is just it doesn't generate the same kind of revenue that the energy sector we have now generates. I mean, for coal, we tax the coal coming out of the ground. There's coal lease bonuses when they lease the land. There's property taxes that they pay, and they employ a lot of people. The mines in Wyoming are the most productive in the country, and yet they still employ about 6,000 people directly. And then in the service sector around that, so to support coal as an industry, you need about another 6,000 to 8,000 people. There's all the activity that those incomes create because they're very well paid. And then you have, the generation sector, and you have the railroad sector to get out of the state. I mean, so the problem with wind is it's just wind turbines, and maybe the production of turbines, and maybe a few people working. So it's a different scale. So we'd need more than just wind.
So in a recent Boomerang article, you stated that there needed to be a cultural shift in Wyoming. Does that include an income tax, a state income tax?
It could. What I was saying was the problem that we face is that we don't tax ourselves. We basically depend on taxes paid by the fossil fuel industry, natural gas, oil, and coal. And the problem is that when those go down, so do our tax revenues. If we moved our tax base to something that was more stable, like people's incomes that fluctuate much less than, say, the energy revenues, then you could offset that boom-bust cycle that we have in government revenues. But all that said, an income tax isn't necessarily the optimal choice. I mean, we could increase property taxes. That's also a very stable base on people's private property, so not just industrial properties, which we rely a lot on now in the energy sector. But, we have some of the lowest residential property taxes and commercial property taxes in the country. We could raise those. We could raise our sales tax. All those have pros and cons. If we raise our sales tax, obviously if you live in the northern part of the state, you're going to lose a lot of business to Montana where they don't have a sales tax. But we could raise it in the southern part of the state because Denver, those areas in Colorado have higher sales taxes than we do. We have room to move our property taxes, but of course any kind of tax increase is just not popular with residents. But unfortunately, if we want services, we're going to have to pay for them. And right now, the real problem is other people pay for our state services. We tax energy, it gets shipped out of state, sold to somebody else, wrapped up in that price is the taxes that the energy sector is paying. So we're effectively exporting our taxes to everybody else in the country. And, the benefit is that's lower taxes when times are good. The downside is when times are bad, we don't have any revenue.
And you did a recent survey that showed that the legislature actually did or passed a less popular version of the budget than what the people of Wyoming wanted. Am I correct about that?
We actually asked respondents to rank a series of different alternatives across a range of policies, whether increase, decrease taxes, or leave them the same. We had primary, the most important agencies maybe that people engage with, so UW, community colleges, K-12 education, roads and bridges, infrastructure, county, that could include county or YDOT. And then we also asked them about whether they would favor using the rainy day fund more or maybe cutting budgets more. And then the last thing we asked was, since it was available and the governor recommended it, whether they would favor expanding Medicaid, so what's been called Obamacare, right? And there's money that would flow to the state. So just recently we've heard that the Casper Medical Center is laying off 58 people, I think. They're facing a $4 million shortfall from basically unpaid bills. Now, had we expanded Medicaid, more people would have insurance, and that could have reduced that. And so what they have already argued is that, that deciding not to expand Medicaid has actually hurt them and probably contributed to this layoff, and also the energy downturn has as well because fewer people have insurance. So all that said, we just asked people, what bundle of policies would you prefer? And we compared it to the kind of bundle that was most consistent with what the budget passed was. And what we found was in that budget, where there was a 1% cut to agency budgets, they basically tapped the rainy day fund for about $200 million over the biennium. And they didn't expand Medicaid. There was about 40% support, 41% support across the electorate in our sample for that. Just expanding Medicaid would have raised the support to 52%. It wouldn't have made a huge difference in our budget deficit because it's only about $33 million per biennium. But what people were saying was, we would prefer to take money offered to us from elsewhere before we cut our own services. And what they also said was, we definitely don't want to raise our taxes. So to answer your question, we find that people generally, people weren't happy at all about this situation. So the way I put it is, do you want a punch in the face, a kick in the face, or both? You don't get to avoid it, right? And we can't avoid the deficit. So nobody's going to be happy. The highest support we got for any set of options was 52%. But what we did find was that people are willing to accept Medicaid expansion, and our legislators weren't. So that might reflect an inconsistency between, say, legislators' preferences, or at least the group that passed it, and the general electorates. In fact, for Medicaid expansion, we even found that Republicans, just Republicans who, stereotypically are cast to be against Obamacare, for example, the support was 51%. It was almost the same as the general public.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm glad to be here.